Many of us, me included, have imagined ourselves as great generals or conquerors, looking at a map, preparing for a campaign. But maps can be deceiving. When Augustus inherited the Roman world after Actium, it had already almost reached its maximum size. We know that because after him many tried to expand it and failed. Don't get me wrong, there were some expansions, you can see them now, but in general, you get my point. On the map, though, the empire seems surrounded by people and territory ripe for conquest. Why not expand further? Isn't that what Romans do? But not all territories are created equal, and conquest has its own necessities. So what happens when you get away from what you need? For the Romans, it was a minimal amount of urbanization and/or the presence of the Mediterranean Sea. Augustus' ambitions stretched beyond merely consolidating what Rome already controlled, though. The great frontier policy of his reign involved securing natural defensive boundaries: the ocean in the west, the desert in the south, the Euphrates in the east, and the Rhine and Danube in the north. For decades, Rome had dealt with Germanic tribes across the Rhine as a constant menace. Augustus envisioned something greater: Germania pacified and incorporated as a new province. The expansion east of the Rhine began around 12 BC with Drusus, Augustus' stepson. Cassius Dio tells us that Drusus advanced deep into Germania, reaching the Elbe. He even erected altars there to mark the furthest point of Roman arms. Despite the harsh terrain and limited supply lines, his campaigns seemed to suggest that Germania could be brought into the Roman system, like Gaul had been a generation earlier. When Drusus died from a riding accident in 9 BC, command passed to his brother Tiberius, who maintained Roman presence and secured client relationships with many tribal leaders. But Germania was very different from Gaul. Roman writers at the time often framed these expeditions as inevitable conquests. Velleius Paterculus, who had served under Tiberius, writes with triumphal certainty about the progress. The Germans were subdued, the peoples across the Rhine conquered, the barbarians sought peace and hostages. But this account, being that of a loyal court historian writing during Tiberius' reign, overstates the permanence of Roman control. Archaeological evidence suggests that the Romans built forts and roads deep into Germania, but they were always precarious. Thin lines of supply stretched across hostile territory, dependent on cooperation of the tribes, whose loyalty was opportunistic at best. The deep woods and rough terrain of Germania didn't agree with the Romans like Gaul did. Then came the crucial shift: the appointment of Publius Quinctilius Varus as governor in 7 AD. Varus was not a general of Drusus' mold, but a man of law and administration. Tacitus, in the Annals, describes him as a man of noble family but sluggish mind, and accustomed to servitude rather than command. This characterization may reflect Tacitus' hindsight after the disaster that's coming, but the essence holds. Varus was a bureaucrat, famous for his work in Syria, where he had ruthlessly suppressed revolts through taxation and crucifixions. He approached Germania with the same tools, treating it as if it were already a pacified province. He imposed Roman legal structures, demanded tribute, and attempted to enforce the Pax Romana in a land that had never been fully conquered. A land where the Romans had built a nervous system, but a thin one. This was the critical miscalculation. The tribes east of the Rhine were neither homogenized nor accustomed to central authority. Their structures were fragmented, their loyalties shifting, and Rome's attempts to impose taxes and courts clashed directly with the Germanic traditions of autonomy and tribal justice. Florus, describes Varus as arrogantly believing he could tame the savages with the power of law. He sneers at this, saying that he brought the curia and the laws into the forest. Whether this is a literally mockery or reflects real Roman frustration, it shows how later writers interpreted the root cause of the catastrophe we are about to witness. Rome's arrogance in assuming Germania could be transformed overnight into another Gaul. Or could be transformed at all, I might add. At the same time, of course, Rome had allies in Germania, men who had been raised in Roman service. Among them was Arminius of the Carosi. Born around 18 BC, he had been taken to Rome as a youth, served as an auxiliary cavalry officer, and even received Roman citizenship and equestrian rank. To Roman eyes, he was a success story, a barbarian noble integrated into Roman systems. Velleius Paterculus, again, who knew him personally, describes him as a young man of noble birth, with a keen mind and spirit, trained in Roman discipline and hardened by service. He seemed the very embodiment of Augustus' policy, Germania's elite Romanized, serving Rome's purposes. But this perception was Rome's fatal blind spot. While outwardly loyal, Arminius was already weaving together an anti-Roman coalition. He exploited precisely the contradictions Varus' governorship, the ones we just talked about, heavy-handed taxation, the legal impositions, the arrogance of treating Germania as subdued. He used this to convince other tribes that Rome's grip was both intolerable and fragile. The Romans mistook their client for a collaborator. In reality, he was preparing one of the most devastating ambushes in Roman history. But before we get bogged down into the details, why did Augustus push so hard into Germania at all? Strategically, the motive was to secure the Rhine frontier by moving it forward to the Elbe. The Rhine itself was not an ideal boundary. It was broad and navigable, allowing for raids and incursions in both directions. By pushing to the Elbe, Rome would have enclosed Germania west of the river, effectively encircling the troublesome tribes and bringing them into the imperial fold. There was also the prestige factor. Augustus wanted to leave his mark as an emperor who extended Rome to its natural limits. After the conquest of Egypt, the annexation of Galatia and the subjugation of the last territories of Spain, Germania was the next logical step. All on a map. You can imagine it, Augustus looking at the map, looking at the line of the Elbe, and just making these calculations. They're good on a map. But then you get to the region itself. Roman sources also reveal an undertone of hubris. So why was Germania so different from Gaul? There is of course a geographical difference. The woods are denser, the territory is rougher, communication is more difficult. But the most important factor is the contact with Rome itself. Gaul had been in deep contact with the Romans for a long time when Caesar marched north. They were already partially Romanized, buying stuff from the Romans, selling stuff to the Romans. The Germanic tribes did no such thing, not on the level of the Celtic tribes. We could say that if we imagine civilization as a line, where cultures climb ahead from uncivilized to civilized, a very simplistic view of course, but bear with me, it's just a tool for us to understand. Being a little closer to the Romans makes you vulnerable. The Celts, the Gauls, were closer. They were civilizing in a certain way. They were building cities. They were producing a little bit of infrastructure. They were on their way to becoming their own civilization on an urbanized level. That made them vulnerable because the Romans could use all of this against them when they conquered them. The Germans, being a lot more uncivilized, if we look at it from a Roman perspective, were far more resistant, providing no opening for the Romans to really influence them. So, in the late summer of 9 AD, Publius Quinctilius Varus was moving his army back toward winter quarters on the Rhine. He had 3 legions with him, the 17th, the 18th, and the 19th. along with auxiliary troops, cavalry, and a huge baggage train of wagons, families, and camp followers. The Romans had spent the summer deep into Germania, enforcing Roman rule in a region Augustus hoped to make into a permanent province. Normally, they would have taken established routes back west toward the Rhine forts, but Arminius, who was there, approached Varus with alarming news. A tribal revolt had broken out in the northeast, near the lands between the Weser and the Lippe. I'm sorry for the pronunciation. He urged Varus to act swiftly, leading the legions through a shorter inland route to put down the rebellion. This was the fatal decision. Instead of keeping to the safer, more open military roads along the Lippe River, Varus turned his men into the unfamiliar territory Arminius was pointing at. He was guided into the hill country of modern Lower Saxony, where thick woods, bogs, and ridges made it impossible to keep tight formations. The exact route is debated, but most scholars now place it at Kalkriese, where the natural geography funnels movement between hill slopes and marshland. It is from Cassius Dio Roman history that we get our fullest narrative of the battle. According to him, Arminius lured Varus into a wooden and swampy region, by spreading reports of tribal uprising, as we said. He writes, "The enemy closed in from all sides, and the Romans could neither advance nor retreat, nor form their ranks, hemmed in by the trees and uneven ground." As far as number of troops go, the sources are difficult to interpret, but going by modern scholar estimations, we have between 18 and 30,000 men for the Germanic side, and the 3 legions plus auxiliaries, maybe between 14,000 and 22,000 depending on losses, on how many auxiliaries were there. It is difficult to give exact numbers. The battle, though, is fascinating because it develops in different days. It is a slow burn. It unfolded beginning with harassment. The writing of Cassius Dio suggests the initial attacks were hit and run, designed to wear down morale. So you have to imagine this Roman column bogged down not only by the terrain but by their wagons behind them, stretching long and thin, being attacked from all sides by smaller groups of Germanic tribesmen. The following day, the army struggled forward. The Germans tightened the noose. Cassius Dio writes that the Romans were being slaughtered continually, as if penned in, and could neither advance nor retire nor deploy themselves for battle. At some point, Varus himself realized the disaster was total. Rather than fall into enemy hands, he fell on his own sword during the battle. And many senior officers followed suit. Florus adds a macabre detail. Varus, more mindful of his dignity than his life, threw himself upon his sword, and the rest of the commanders followed his example. The enemy mutilated their bodies and nailed their heads to trees. Whether this reflects fact or Roman imagination of barbaric cruelty, it became part of the horror story Rome told itself about Teutoburg. But this wasn't over. Day 2 was a full assault. They were attacked from all sides, fighting without their formation, what made the Romans strong, in a drawn-out conflict forced on troops that were already wounded, tired from a long campaign during the summer. By the 3rd day, cohesion had collapsed. Small groups of Romans attempted to break out, but were hunted down. Cassius Dio claims that a handful escaped to tell the tale, but that the bulk of the 3 legions were annihilated. Not a man survived save the few who fled the rout. The figures are staggering, perhaps 15,000 to 20,000 dead, along with thousands of camp followers, 3 eagle standards captured, an almost unthinkable disgrace. Arminius didn't win a difficult battle. There is very little tactically to say about Teutoburg, but that is because strategically he had completely defeated Varus before he even had to draw his sword. He had brought Varus and his 3 legions in an impossible defensive position, with enemies prepared to attack them, and then him and his men had exhausted them, taking a whole day to attack them and attack them and attack them. Tacitus, in his Annals, describes the disaster in words meant to evoke horror. Hemmed in by the forest, by the marsh, by the enemy, they could neither move or deploy, nor use their skill in fighting. The three legions had once embodied Roman invincibility. They were reduced to a mob, scattered through the trees, incapable of forming the tight manipular blocks that had conquered Gaul and the Mediterranean. Velleius Paterculus insists that the loss was due to treachery more than cowardice. Through the perfidy of a single man, the state suffered the greatest disaster it had endured since the Cimbrian War. Of course, by emphasizing betrayal, he absolves Roman failure, a narrative convenient under Tiberius' reign. Yet, this very insistence suggests how deep the humiliation ran. Rome could not accept that Germanic tribes, long deemed primitive, had bested his finest soldiers except by treachery. But while the people that acted this ambush were tribal, they were not incapable of refined tactical acts. One of the most telling finds in the region we think was the stage for the battle is the remainings of earthworks, a long wall or rampart constructed by Germanic forces, stretching for hundreds of meters, designed to funnel the Roman column into a narrow ground where the ambush was inevitable. This is a level of engineering of the battlefield that is fascinating to find related to Germanic tribes known to be uncivilized and unrefined at the time. And so silence fell on the Teutoburg Forest, but noise would start to ring out from Rome. When the word of Teutoburg reached their eternal city, it was like thunder in clear skies. The empire had known defeat before, Aurasio, Carrhae, Cani, but those disasters were eventually redeemed by later victories. Teutoburg was different. The three legions were gone, their standards lost, their commanders dead. More than that, Rome's entire project of conquering Germania was suddenly in ruins, annihilated, no more. Suetonius paints a vivid picture of Augustus' reaction. Upon hearing the news, he let his hair and beard grow for months, and would often dash his head against the door, crying out, "Quintilii vare, legiones rede! Quintilius Varus, give me back my legions!" This image of the old emperor, broken and humiliated, became one of the defining anecdotes of his reign. Whether literal or exaggerated, it captures how the loss was not just military, but deeply personal. Augustus had envisioned Germania as his final great conquest, the keystone of his frontier policy. Instead, it became the scar that marked the limits of his empire. I have to add that I do believe this recollection is real and accurate. Why? Because Augustus is revered almost as a god in every literary production from his time and in later times. So this is not the normal way we see Augustus from the eyes of the writers. This is an outliner, a humiliating one. So at least in my eyes, it can only be there because it's true, and people knew about it. The Rhine frontier shook under the impact. With three legions annihilated, fear spread that Germania could pour across the river into Gaul. Cassius Dio tells us that the Romans were in great terror lest the Germans should invade Italy itself. Augustus ordered emergency levies. He even considered conscripting freedmen and lowering age requirements for service. The empire braced for collapse. But the feared invasion, of course, never came. Arminius had achieved a stunning victory, but he lacked the infrastructure or unified command to press beyond the Rhine. And probably the reason. He didn't want to conquer Rome, he wanted to free Germania. He had a very clear image of what he could do, and achieved it. The surviving Romans who were enslaved by the Germans were scattered among the tribes, or subjugated to ritual sacrifice. When Germanicus reached the battlefield in 15 AD, he found altars upon which the tribunes and centurions had been slaughtered. Skulls nailed to trees, bones left unburied, pits filled with remains. These images are intended to horrify Roman readers, but they may reflect a mix of fact and rhetorical exaggeration. There is evidence that some prisoners were ransomed or exchanged in later years, but many never returned. Cassius Dio mentions that some of the captives were held in chains for life. Others were absorbed into the Germanic society, their Roman identities dissolving. To the Roman imagination, this was worse than death. Legionaries, symbols of Roman order, vanishing into barbarian obscurity. The Roman reaction would be a two-hit combination. First came Tiberius, heir of Augustus, who stabilized the region. A cautious general, avoiding rash offensive deep into Germania, and who mainly worked on the border and on putting the tribes back in line. But then, under Tiberius' reign, came Germanicus. He was sent across the Rhine with a massive force to punish the tribes and recover Rome's honor. He was Tiberius' nephew. Between 14 and 16 AD, Germanicus launched repeated campaigns, defeating Arminius in open battle and devastating enemy lands. Germanicus was at the time known as Nero Claudius Drusus, of course. The name Germanicus would be gained with this invasion of Germania. With his repeated campaigns, he defeated Arminius in open battle and devastated the land itself. It was a vengeance expedition. Germanicus also succeeded in recovering 2 of the lost eagles, though the third would not be retrieved until decades later under Claudius. Each recovery was celebrated as restoration of Roman dignity, a reversal of Varus' shame. Yet despite these victories, Germanicus was recalled by Tiberius, maybe because he was jealous. I have a whole video about Tiberius and Caligula if you'd like to know more. In the end, the fate of Arminius was dark. He survived the ambush, he survived the battle with Germanicus, but was killed, assassinated, by his own kin in 21 AD. Tacitus sums up his career with reluctant admiration. Without a doubt, he was the liberator of Germania. He fought not for the empire, but for freedom. In battle, he was the assailant of Rome. In war, he remained unconquered. He lived 37 years, he reigned 12. And he was the man who, more than any other, by his victory or by his fall, has been sung by the nations. Not just a rebel, but a mythical figure. The story of Teutoburg deeply embedded himself in the Roman psyche. The figure of Arminius became central to this memory. Roman sources wrestle with him. Velleius Paterculus, who had served on the Rhine, calls him a treacherous villain. Yet, Tacitus elevates him into something larger, as we just said. After the end of the Roman Empire, Teutoburg faded. Medieval chroniclers hardly mention it. Arminius was no Charlemagne or Barbarossa. For 1,000 years, the battle was buried under other more important wars. But in the 16th century, humanist scholars rediscovered Tacitus' works, and with them the story of Arminius. Suddenly, he was reframed as Hermann, the first German national hero. In an age of Protestant identity and struggles against Rome, he was not a traitor but a freedom fighter who expelled foreign oppressors. In the 19th century, however, Teutoburg became political dynamite. As German states moved toward unification, Hermann was celebrated even more as the founding father of the nation. Plays, poems, and monuments cast him as the German Moses, leading his people out of Roman bondage. This nationalist myth-making did not stop with Bismarck, though. In the 20th century, Hermann was appropriated again, most notoriously by the Nazis. He was casted as a proto-Aryan liberator. Nazi propaganda turned Teutoburg into proof that Germany was destined to resist Rome's degenerate empire, just as it would resist modern enemies. Archaeological digs in the 1930s were wrapped into ideology, meant to legitimize racial narratives. After 1945, Hermann's image became more complicated. Post-war Germany distanced itself from nationalist myth, but the monumental trace remained. The Battle of the Teutoburg Forest lingers because it speaks to more than strategy or terrain. It exposes the limits of empire and the power of memory. Rome suffered defeats almost everywhere in the empire, yet none struck so deep. Here, Augustus' legions were not simply beaten but annihilated, in a place so alien and so hostile that the story could never be told without dread. Almost like the three legions disappeared on another planet. Suetonius' picture of the old emperor beating his head against the walls, crying for his lost legions, captures not just personal grief, but the shock of an empire realizing his own borders, his own limitations. For the Romans, Teutoburg was the humiliation that froze expansion. That wound reopened whatever Tacitus or Dio set pen to paper. For the Germans, centuries later, it became the myth of freedom, proof that their ancestors had stood against the might of Rome. The one battle, fought in mud and trees, became a vessel for ideologies and identities long after the bones were gone. And perhaps that is the real legacy of Teutoburg. Not that the three legions perished in the rain, but that their death echoed across millennia. The forest swallowed Varus, the 17th, the 18th, and the 19th, but it gave back Arminius, Hermann, and the legend of a people who defied Rome, a legend of a people moved by an individualistic way of thinking. And if you think about it, isn't the culture of the West a mixture of Roman and Germanic ideology? The Romans gave us so much. They gave us law, they gave us political structures, but the Romans were individualistic to a point. It was for the glory of Rome, after all. With the injection of the Germanic individual, well, maybe Arminius and his men are more in our bloodstream than we think.